Good evening, everyone. Come on, we can do better than that. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's only October 2nd. You can't be that tired yet. My name is Frank Garritti. I'm professor of history in African American and African diaspora studies here at Columbia. I've also had the honor and privilege of being the executive director of the Eric H. Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights since 2022. It's my fourth year. Can't believe it. Created in 2017, the Holder Initiative aims to inspire our undergraduate students to draw upon their superior liberal arts education to do impactful democracy work during their time here on Columbia's campus and beyond. Through the creation of timely and innovative programming, such as what we're doing tonight, the sponsorship of student research projects and internships, and the creation of a justice-oriented curriculum, the Holder Initiative aims to cultivate a broad conception of justice, one that seeks to empower students to address many of the central issues of our time. And of course, here on this campus, indeed, our students have been confronting some of the central issues of our time, certainly over the last 2 years. I want to welcome you to another installment of the America Voter Project series. Last spring, we had a memorable conversation on the topic of reimagining our democracy with A.G. Holder, Maria Teresa Kumar of Voto Latino, Maurice Mitchell of the Working Families Party, and Karine Jean-Pierre, the former White House press secretary, just a few months into this current administration. That was back in April, when its authoritarian intentions were becoming clear. Now here we are, 6 months later, the world continues to turn upside down. And the crisis that continues to unfold clearly indicates that the road ahead is involving much more than calling a representative and voting for the right candidates, something that everybody on this panel knows very well. It involves a radical reimagining of what democracy means for the 21st century. So in some ways, we're continuing that conversation tonight, right? Even as we zero in on a very important topic, redistricting. Okay? Especially now that the current administration has clearly dispensed with the law and the authoritarian reality settling in by the hour. I want to thank, as always, Beth Manchester, who's there in the back. Round of applause for Beth, who really is the heart and soul of the Holder Initiative, along with our students. She's the Senior Associate Director, who, as always, does an extraordinary job putting together this event and everything we do, and I want to thank her for doing it yet again. And I want to thank you all for coming during what's always a busy time here at Columbia and spending time with us this evening to talk about this important topic, redistricting. Now I will introduce our distinguished panelists. To my immediate left, of course, is Eric Holder, the namesake of the initiative and the 82nd Attorney General of the United States. Since his tenure as AG, he has been chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which we will talk about tonight, I am sure, a leading organization in the fight against gerrymandering and the fight to create fair electoral maps throughout the country. As we all know, Eric is also one of Columbia's favorite sons, graduating from the college in 1973 and the law school in 1976. Eric, we're always super grateful for you to spend time with us and be generous. Please, a round of applause for A.G. Holder. To A.G. Holder's left is Vanita Gupta, who has devoted her career to advancing civil rights, strengthening democratic norms, and building safe communities at national organizations and in the federal government. Gupta is currently a distinguished scholar in residence at NYU School of Law, where she teaches and speaks about civil rights, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the intersection of public policy and law. She recently launched the NGO Solidarity Network, which supports nonprofit organizations in the face of governmental threats to ensure that they can remain mission-focused and stand strong together. She's also served as a consultant for several pro-democracy organizations. And of course, from 2021 to 2024, Gupta served as the 19th Associate Attorney General of the United States. She was the first civil rights lawyer in top 3 leadership positions at the department. As Associate Attorney General, she supervised 13 components of the department, including its civil litigating divisions and grant-making offices. She also spearheaded initiatives focusing on building police community trust, reproductive rights post-Dobbs, environmental justice, mental health, and gun violence prevention. It's a long bio. I'm going to curtail it just a bit more. She began her legal career as an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where she successfully led the effort to overturn wrongful drug convictions of 30 individuals in Tulia, Texas, which we just talked about in the green room years ago. A round of applause for Vanita Gupta. Our third panelist is Michael Lee, who is senior counsel in the outstanding Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Lee practiced law at Baker Botts LLP in Dallas for 10 years. He and I have a Texas connection. I taught at UT Austin before I came here, and Michael is from Texas, although he's here now. He knows Texas well, which is going to be an asset in this conversation, I can assure you. In addition to his election law work, Lee previously served as executive director of B1 Texas, a donor alliance that oversaw strategic and targeted investments in nonprofit organizations working to increase voter participation and engagement in historically disadvantaged Black and Latino Texas communities. Lee was the author of a widely cited blog on redistricting, which I read closely before this session, in election law issues that the New York Times called indispensable. He's a regular writer and commentator on election law issues on various media outlets. Please join me with a round of applause for Michael Lee. So those of you familiar with our format, we're going to proceed tonight as we have in the past. I will pose questions to the panelists. We're somewhere around 3 or 4 or so, maybe more. There'll be follow-ups. The panelists can talk to each other. And then after about an hour or so, or maybe 50 minutes or so, then we'll have time for questions and answers with you all. Okay? Sound good? So let's proceed. So I want to start with a question. I'm going to direct it to A.G. Holder. And this might seem like a silly question, but I'm not sure that it is. For those of us who are not familiar with the issue of redistricting and gerrymandering, right, can you describe what it is, right, or what it has been, and in the long array of American history, which you know very well, right, as you wrote about in your book a couple of years ago, and how the practice has changed or is changing after the new administration took office in January?
Well, first off, let me welcome all of you. It's great to see you. And this is early in the new semester, so I hope everybody, as Frank was saying, is still, not fatigued and ready to learn some stuff. And we want to learn from you. So at the end of this, we'll have that interaction, which I find in some ways the most stimulating part, to hear what you all are thinking. So nobody be shy. Nobody be shy. Yes. And everything, you can ask whatever you want to ask. Vanita will answer any question that you have. Exactly. Gerrymandering is almost as old as the Republic itself. If you look at Patrick Henry, give me liberty, give me death, Virginia politician, he actually, he didn't like James Monroe or James Madison, and he liked the other, I forget which James, but he drew districts in Virginia, way back when, to exclude one of the Jameses. And so gerrymandering has been with us since then. It's been practiced by both parties, Democrats as well as Republicans. But this current iteration of gerrymandering that we're dealing with, I think really traces its roots back to a thing called Project Red Map that the Republican Party used after the 2010 census. They were very effective at what they did, and frankly, Democrats were caught flat on their feet. They used the new technology. They used a whole variety of things to come up with ways in which they could, remember the 2010 election, where Barack Obama called that a shellacking, gave huge amounts of power to the Republican Party just in time for the redistricting that happened in 2011. And they created gerrymanders that lasted through the course of that decade. They were still in the process of unwinding. And gerrymandering really is just a way in which you draw district lines, both at the state level as well as at the federal level, United States House of Representatives and state legislatures, so that you virtually guarantee that a particular person from a particular party is going to win that seat. Doesn't matter what the other party does. Doesn't matter how good the candidate is. The lines are drawn in such a way that with a good gerrymander, you can predict the outcome. And the negative impact of that is that if you're in a safe seat, if I'm a Democrat, a Republican, let's be wildly imaginative here. I'm a Republican, and I'm in a Republican gerrymandered seat. I don't have to worry about a general election. I'm going to win the general election because of the gerrymander. My only concern is not being primaried. And so that drives me further and further to the right, so I don't get a challenger in a primary. And to be fair, to drive Democrats further and further to the left. If you cooperate, work across the aisle with your Democratic counterpart, I'm a Republican, I remember, that is seen as a sign of weakness and invites a primary challenge. Because we don't work together, not much gets done. The American people have all of these demands, all of these things that they expect out of their legislatures at the state level as well as at the federal level. Nothing happens. People get cynical about the effectiveness of government. And so that's one of the negatives. The other big negative of gerrymandering is that representatives at the state level, at the federal level, can do things inconsistent with the desires of the people who they are supposed to represent and face no electoral consequence. I mean, if you look at the question of abortion, you know, look at all the polling. There's not one state where people were in favor of the overturning of Roe versus Wade and then all of the anti-choice measures that were put in place. Now, you know, margins would differ. In New York, more pro-choice than, say, Oklahoma. But no state was more pro-life than pro-choice when it came to the overturning of Roe. But these state legislatures could put into effect these anti-choice laws, not necessarily supported by the people, but because of the gerrymanders in which they were drawn, they had no electoral consequence. And so you have a gap created between voters and the people who are supposed to represent them. And this is inconsistent with our sense of democracy. You know, the people are supposed to decide the direction of the nation to a certain degree, you know, what policies are supposed to be put in place. They certainly ought to have some ability to have an impact on, or the ability to say, well, this congressman, this state representative did something that I don't agree with. I'm going to vote against him and get a bunch of people to vote against him, and we'll replace him or her. And in a gerrymandered district, you can't do that. So it's been with us, as I said, from the beginning of the republic to where we are now. But with the technological tools that we now have, you know, in the old days, you could say, we can kind of figure out where this neighborhood is going to vote. And so we can draw lines around this neighborhood. Now, with the technology that we have, you can figure out who lives in a particular house and how, you know, how Johnny's going to vote, how, you know, Susie's likely to vote. And you can draw really, really, really fine gerrymanders that become increasingly effective and anti-democracy.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll get to you, Michael, in a second. I mean, like, you mentioned the long array of this practice, right? I'm very familiar with Heather Cox Richardson. She's a historian who has a gift that I don't have, could give on-the-spot political analysis and anchor in American history. So she was talking about when the Federalists were trying to wipe out their opponents leading up to the 1800 election and how it backfired against them, right? So she, you know, she's trying to say, as you're suggesting here, there's a long history here of this practice, and yet there is the urgency of now, which you're getting at from the technological standpoint, but there are other issues at play too. So yes, Michael.
This is working? Yeah.
Yes.
So A.G. Holder is absolutely right. This is a long-standing problem in American political life, but I do think it is getting worse, and it has changed in some ways. And you see this in the most recent round of mid-decade redistricting starting in Texas, but that has now spread to Missouri and other states, and looks both red and blue. And one of the things that has changed is you see the president getting involved. Like, the president traditionally does not at all get involved in redistricting. And yet here you see President Trump going to Republicans in Texas and saying, I want 5 more seats out of your state. He recently had Republicans from Indiana there saying, I want you to get me 1 or 2 additional seats out of Indiana. And that kind of heavy-handedness is new. It's also new that, mid-decade redistricting sometimes took place, but usually it happened when control of the process changed. Like, Democrats drew the map and then Republicans won control. They would go back and redraw the map, or vice versa. What is different now is, take Texas, for example. Republicans in Texas drew a map in 2021 that they liked. It's a very good map for them. Ted Cruz in 2024 got 53% of the vote in Texas. Republicans won 67% of congressional seats. So that's a really great map for them. And it was working, and everybody was happy. Nobody had to really worry about anything. But they went back and they redrew it to try to get 5 more seats, which, if successful, will give them 80% of seats, right? And so it's rare that parties want to go back and revisit, in part because doing redistricting is a little bit like getting a root canal or a colonoscopy. It's something that, it's good for you, and you may want to do it, but not regularly, and now people are doing it. And I worry a little bit that this is only the beginning, that we're going to start to do this every 2 years, right? You know, like, okay, let's design the map for the 2026 midterms. Oh, wait, the politics look different. Let's redraw the map again for 2028. And that's a really sort of dangerous world.
I know it typically happens, just really quickly, is that the census happens every 10 years, in a year ending in 0, and that's by constitutional mandate. That we have to count all the people in this country, and that's a whole other question. But we have to count everybody in a year ending in 0, so 2020, 2030. And then traditionally after that, the year after, based on that new census data, the lines are redrawn to reflect population shifts, population increases, a whole variety of things. And that generally is supposed to be it. Then you wait till the next census, and then you do the next round of redistricting. As Michael said, we're now involved in a whole bunch of mid-cycle redistricting. Vanita?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the census part of that, which is because not everyone may know about what is so astonishing about the type of redistricting that is happening in Texas, and that's the mid-decade redistricting that Michael was talking about. And so the census is every 10 years. How many of you have ever filled out a census form? Probably your parents were doing it for 2020. So, I mean, the reason why any of this matters is because, as A.G. Holder said, voters are supposed to pick their politicians, not politicians picking their voters. But also, the district lines matter because Congress uses districts to allocate all kinds of economic benefits, values, school districts, et cetera. There's a lot that flows, like stuff that you and I are dealing with every day in our daily lives, like can flow from the way that districts are carved out. So there's like very significant impact. And one of the things that we saw, kind of an early manipulation, was not just with what's happening now, this mid-decade redistricting where they're going mid-cycle with no new data whatsoever from a new census and trying to change the rules. But in 2019 and 2018, the president also tried to introduce a citizenship question into the census to try to find out who is a citizen, who is a non-citizen. And a lot of us were fighting that question both in courts and in the organizing we were doing to try to make sure that we could actually have an accurate count. There was a lot of concern that asking the citizenship question on this decennial census was going to discourage people from actually filling it out. And so I think that we've seen a lot of different ways that people who want to manipulate the process can have different entry points into it. And we are very concerned about what is going to happen with the 2030 census, because there are a lot of ways to manipulate that. But I think fundamentally what we need to understand is that the administration right now, with mid-decade redistricting, with trying to push birthright citizenship, with trying to change the rules on who counts and how resources are allocated, is engaged in a power grab, and that they are trying to change the rules in order to entrench their power. And we are supposed to, in our democracy, have rules to protect against that. And there's going to be a lot of litigation. But I think we need to call it for what it is. And it's why organizations that, like the Brennan Center and others, that have long been trying to fight for voting rights and to make sure that voters of color and other folks who've been historically marginalized from this process are able to have their vote counted and not have their vote taken away, why they've been hard at work. These are nonpartisan organizations, as well as the parties engaged in this process, but this is fundamentally a power grab, and it's why we need to make sure that we are paying attention and doing all of the things that we need to do to protect our democracy right now.
Well,
And
I was going to say, again, very quickly, as I said, gerrymandering's been with us for as long as we've been a nation, which doesn't mean it's right. I mean, let me just make that clear. It's bad, whoever does it. But the census is something that traditionally has been an apolitical event. When we came into office in 2009 when I started at the Justice Department with the new Obama administration, the Bush administration handed over to us a good plan for the census, and that was kind of how it went. Republican pass it off to Democrats, Democrats pass it off to Republicans. The census is kind of like just a good civic exercise, constitutionally mandated, and the then Trump administration, the now Trump administration, has made an attempt to to jimmy around with that, to come up with a result that they think will entrench their power and keep them in office. Michael?
Well, I'll go back to gerrymandering a little bit. In talking about gerrymandering, I do think that we have to acknowledge the villain in the room, right, or in the wings, which is the Supreme Court, right? In 2019, the Supreme Court, in a case called Rucho versus Common Cause, said we, the federal courts, are not going to police partisan gerrymandering. These are not claims that can be brought in federal court. They're political questions. They're too hard for us to decide. And we're just not going to do that. And so I think a lot of the brazenness now that you see is, before there was always the thought, like, well, maybe if we go too far, the Supreme Court will step in and stop us. And now I think people increasingly feel, because the Supreme Court said we're not going to police it, that they can get away with anything. And that really sort of cuts, I think, across a lot of democracy issues where, the court has seemed to be, to many, not lacking a little bit in backbone and bravery and not really being the check that we sort of expect. So that we do need to recognize that, this is a world that we live in part because it's the world the Supreme Court gave us, despite telling us we had nothing to worry about. They were wrong.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why you see Texas politicians who were engaged in this effort saying, we're engaged in drawing a partisan gerrymander. I mean, they'll just say it out loud, and you think, wow, that's pretty bold. How could they just say that? Well, because the Supreme Court said, in essence, partisan gerrymander is okay. They can't be seen as doing a racial gerrymander because, at least up to now, that would violate the Voting Rights Act. And so they at great pains to say, no, this is not a racial gerrymander. It's not a racial gerrymander. This is a partisan gerrymander. And it's really a function of that Rucho decision, 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court.
Every racially discriminatory thing now gets defended on the basis of politics. We were targeting Democrats, and the fact that they happen to be black, we have nothing against them for that.
One of the tools that the Justice Department had long used to try to ensure fairness in redistricting was Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so, speaking of the court, it hasn't gotten nearly as much attention because we're all saturated with so much news, but in a few weeks, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a very important case that could end up gutting what remains of the Voting Rights Act out of a challenge around Louisiana's redistricting. And this is a big deal, and I think some of you may know that back in 2014, in a devastating decision called Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, sorry.
And we never call it the Shelby County versus Holder
It was just
decision.
Shelby County.
It's just the Shelby County case, all right? One of the worst.
Shelby County's too long. We should call it Holder, right?
No, we definitely don't. But this
That would like having your name like Dred Scott versus Holder. You don't want your name associated with that case. It's the Shelby County.
No, you're decidedly on the right side of that case. So it's but the Supreme Court was not on A.G. Holder's side in that case and issued a really devastating blow to the heart of the Voting Rights Act, which gave the Justice Department the power to be able to evaluate through data what kinds of election changes, hyper-local, big ones, state ones, had racially discriminatory impact and were disenfranchising black and brown voters. And the tool that had been used for over, decades, was basically taken away, and it resulted in the department not being able to have these checks before changes were made, and then having to wait till states made these changes and then file, and then spend years litigating while countless elections took place using the rules that were sometimes later declared unconstitutional by the courts. So now there were shreds of Section 2 remaining, but the court is about to hear a very important decision that could result in the complete death knell of Section 2. And so I say this just because I think it's important that when we're talking about redistricting, we actually have to talk about kind of much broader, as we are, kind of attacks on core democratic institutions and democratic values that have existed for decades, right now being so much at stake. And it's why we need all of you to care, to pick up the mantle, because a lot of what we built and what we have taken for granted in this country is at the precipice or is being kind of gutted, and we have to get much more creative about how we think about solutions to these long-standing problems about inequality, unequal access in our democracy.
And I'd love to get into sort of pushback and things that we can do here in a bit. So we've already meandered into the territory that I wanted to get to, which is that, how things are urgent and worse. But I want to linger here just a little longer, if we could, and talk about, what's happening with respect to Trump's sort of mandate to Republican governors to, make sure you deliver us these states and these seats. So, what's happening in these cases, whether it was the Missouri situation or Texas or Utah? Are there anything interesting there, or are we seeing just states and governors follow lockstep in what the president and the executive branch wants?
Well, you have, the president going to the Texas folks and say, give me 5 additional congressional seats. And I think it's really interesting. He went to the folks in Georgia and said, give me 11,780 votes. And I don't agree with Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, on probably anything. But I give him some credit. He stood up and said, no, we're not going to do that. Greg Abbott and the folks in Texas said, gotcha, no problem. We now see that happening in Missouri as well, and they're working on potentially other states, Indiana, Kansas, Florida. Look for that. They'll start hearings there, Utah. They're looking for ways in which they can draw the lines, again, so that they can get additional seats. And it really comes out of political fear. They're concerned that their policies are not necessarily popular, and that in the 2026 midterms, they're going to get just decimated. And Trump doesn't want to face a Democratic House of Representatives with Hakeem Jeffries as the Speaker of the House. That means that hearings happen, subpoenas go out, a whole range of things. A check, imagine that. A check coming out of the legislative branch on what the executive branch is trying to do. And so that's why they're going around the country and trying to get these Republican legislatures to do their bidding. And this is fundamentally anti-democracy. It's all about the retention of power.
It just bears mentioning that disproportionately the seats that they are targeting are the seats of non-white members, in particular black members. They dismantled districts in Houston, for example, that had long elected a black member. Likewise, in Missouri, they dismantled the seat of a black Democrat from Kansas City. There are rumors today that the North Carolina legislature may try to get rid of a seat represented by a black Democrat for 30-some years in eastern North Carolina. There are even rumors that they may go after the South Carolina seat of Jim Clyburn, right? And so, they're not only getting more Republican seats, but they are really targeting the political power of communities of color, and that cannot be lost in this story. It cannot just become a D's versus R's story. It really is an assault on the multiracial democracy that has been emerging.
Yeah, and I think we also need to keep in mind, like Texas, what they're putting in place is a gerrymander on top of an existing gerrymander. The NDRC, the organization I have, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, we're suing and have been in a lawsuit with Texas, with others, to challenge that existing gerrymander. Texas got an additional couple of seats because of the increase in the population of Texas after the census. Well, the increase was like 90% as a result of people of color, overwhelmingly because of an influx of Hispanic folks into Texas. And what did they do? They created 2 additional majority white districts. Kind of like, wait a minute, what's that all about? So that brings the initial lawsuit. Now they want to put a gerrymander at the request of Donald Trump into place on top of that gerrymander that further does damage to the political power of communities of color in Texas. And so we're suing them again. We've already filed suit in Missouri, and we'll take whatever steps we can through the courts to try to stop that which they are trying to put in place.
So that gives a sense, and Texas to me has always been the classic gerrymandered red state, right? Really politically, it should look more like what a California might be, right? Having worked and lived in Austin, Texas for quite some time, and to see the kind of the political reality on the ground vis-a-vis what gets represented in the state legislature is astonishing. I mean, you could really see the kind of, I mean, one, because the state had been Democratic, I mean, for the wrong reasons, partly because it was a Jim Crow state, but when it was in that transition in the 60s, there are these strong traditions of the party in the state, and then we've seen that obliterated over the course of several decades now. So the Texas case is always endlessly fascinating to me as somebody who worked and has written about it and myself. So let's talk about pushback and what can be done, right? Either on the legal front, as you're doing with the NDRC, and then also politically to the administration's agenda. What efforts are happening? How do we make sense of what California was starting to do or starting this summer, right? With their own redistricting plan. Are we essentially resorting to lawsuits and that's it? What are the sorts of mobilization that can happen to sort of push back on these issues and others against the administration's agenda? You can start anywhere.
All right. Well, I mean, certainly with regard to this latest Texas gerrymander, California said, all right, Texas is going to try to get 5 seats. Governor Newsom and other folks in California said, well, no, we're just not going to let that happen. California has a great independent commission that draws the lines. It's kind of like the gold standard. And California folks said, we can't just kind of sit there and like unilaterally disarm. Let them do what it is that they're doing. And so they've come up with a system where they're going to redraw their lines and hopefully increase the number of Democrats who will serve in the House delegation from California. Additional 5 seats. I thought long and hard about what California was doing and said, is this something that we should support? Because we've been at the NDRC fighting for fairness. The reality is, because I think Democrats, progressives, will do just fine if the system's fair. If the system's just fair, we'll do just fine. Fairness is almost like a weapon for us. But in light of what happened in Texas, I tended to agree with what happened in California. And I said, all right, what you do has to be responsive, and this is certainly responding to that which Texas does. It has to be responsible. They could have gone with more seats, but they stopped at 5. And it has to be temporary. It has to be something that you put in place for some small period of time. And what they decided is to say, all right, we're going to do this, but when we get to the 2030 census and the redistricting in 2031, we're going to go back to using our commission. And the people in California have to vote to say that this change in their system, this change in not relying on the independent commission is something that's okay. Texas, you had hundreds, thousands of people testifying against it, editorial boards saying that what Texas was doing was wrong, Republicans off the record saying, we don't really like this, but they rammed it through. In California, the people are ultimately going to be the ones who will have the ability to decide whether or not this new plan is something that should go into effect. So those who equate Texas and California, I think are fundamentally wrong. The processes are different, and the people, at the end of the day in California, will have the ability to say whether this should happen, or not.
And I just want to put a fine point on this, which is a lot of us as kind of democracy, civil rights advocates for years had been promoting the idea of independent commissions, where you have an even set of seats from Democrats and Republicans to come together, work it out, and draw maps after the decennial census. But this thing about if we did not react in some way to what the president and Texas were doing, that it would have been literally just unilateral, kind of asymmetrical warfare and unilateral disarmament, as you said, I think is really important. And it is, I think what California is going to go through is going to also require organizing and voters around this initiative, because they are having to fight the mid-decade redistricting that started in Texas, and voters are going to, redistricting, I mean, it's not the sexiest topic. I'm sure that you guys are like, oh my God, like gerrymandering, redistricting, like, yawn.
Wake up.
But it is so important in all of these ways that are kind of unseen to a lot of us in our daily lives. And yet what flows from redistricting is power and resources from the federal government. And so the need to have active organizing, and I wouldn't just say, obviously California's got the initiative that they're going to have to lead, but there's other states, and maybe Michael, you can talk about them, about where voters have to express their own reactions to some of this mid-decade redistricting and some of the games that lawmakers in their state are playing that are literally going to disenfranchise them, which dilute their vote if in a mid-decade redistricting cycle. And so it is hard. It's a challenge because making this interesting and making it matter to people can be its own challenge. And yet, we need people to care and to organize as voters and as litigators and to show up in their state legislatures where this is happening and to make their voices heard about this effort to rig the game.
Yeah, I mean, one example of people fighting back is potentially in Missouri, where they passed this very gerrymandered map that eliminated the seat of Emanuel Cleaver in Kansas City. It happens that in Missouri, voters can repeal laws passed by the legislature, and there is an effort underway to get that on the ballot. And the good news there is if you get it on the ballot, then the law is suspended till people can vote on it. And so, that's something that is great. Unfortunately, in some of the places where this stuff is going to happen, particularly in the southern states, you really don't have that kind of remedy because a lot of southern democracy doesn't quite work as well, didn't before and doesn't now. Compared to other states. And I do think this ultimately points to the fact that you do need some kind of national solution, right? We have a very unlevel playing field. We've always said that, but then it's really become clear through this. And the good news is that, there are bills like the Freedom to Vote Act, which Congress came close to passing during the Biden administration, would have ended this. It would have banned mid-decade redistricting. It would have imposed a ban on partisan gerrymandering in congressional districts. It would have strengthened lots of other protections and procedural safeguards, made it easier to litigate cases. Another bill, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would have modernized the Voting Rights Act for the 21st century. It also came really close to passing. It had enough votes actually to pass. The only thing was that the two Democratic senators were not willing to make an exception to the filibuster to allow it to come to an up or down vote. But I think now people... and there's been some criticism of the last administration about whether they properly prioritize some of these bills. I think now for members, including some Republican members, the idea that democracy reform is important at the federal level is hopefully a little bit clearer than it was before. But, we do ultimately need national standards, a level playing field, and there has to be a national solution, particularly for the South. Because if you think about the South over its history has changed at various points. It's almost always required an outside federal assist. It's never sort of gotten there on its own. And this, I think, is not going to be different.
Yeah, I mean, Michael makes, I think, an extremely important point. Congress has the ability. It's in the Constitution. Congress shall determine the manner and means that federal elections are held. They have the ability, if a bill is passed, to say you can't do partisan gerrymandering. You can't do it. And we had enough people in the House and in the Senate to pass that bill. But the filibuster in the Senate requires you got to have 60 votes. Well, we had enough power if we'd gotten 2 Democratic senators to say we're going to change the rule, we do a carve-out so that for democracy-related matters, you only have to have 50 votes, Senators, let's 2 senators. This is Manchin and Sinema. I spent a lot of time on the phone talking to these folks. And I remember a picture of the 2 of them at some conference or something, and they were high-fiving each other about the fact that they had sustained the existence of the filibuster. I'd like to talk to them now, given all that's going on in our democracy with this mid-cycle stuff, Donald Trump saying, give me 5 seats, and this kind of race to the bottom that we are now engaged in, that would have been prohibited if that bill had been passed. So the next time the Democrats, it's going to have to be Democrats. It's not going to be Republicans. Democrats have, trifecta control, the presidency, Senate, the House of Representatives. You're going to have that carve-out passed. This legislation has got to be reintroduced, and it's got to be passed. Our democracy depends on this stuff. We got to take away from these anti-democracy folks the tools, that they have. But Manchin and Sinema, I'm real proud of the 2 of you. Real proud.
I do think you might get some Republicans now, like Kevin Kiley, who's one of the Republicans who got drawn out of a seat in California, has introduced a bill to ban mid-decade redistricting that cribs word for word from the Freedom to Vote Act. So he at least partially seems to have gotten the gospel. But,
When his ass got thrown out, he's like, oh, now I care. Now
Well,
I
and
care.
it's not guaranteed that the 5 new districts that got created in Texas are going to result in
Right.
what the Republican Party wants. There's, these were districts in some cases that turned to Trump in this election, heavily Latino voters. But I mean, there's no kind of guarantee that those voters are going to show up in the same way, and it will be very interesting. I mean, that's why you've had Republicans in certain states resist the president's demand that they engage in redistricting, including in places like New Hampshire and other places. But this is making a lot of Republicans and incumbent Republicans nervous. So it'll be interesting to see whether, I don't think redistricting is going to be the thing that gets these voters to the poll. It will be groceries, and it will be the economy, and it'll be healthcare, but I mean, there could be real downstream consequences to this brazen effort to basically, do the power grab in some of these places. And I do think that could end up having some serious impact on how this whole effort looks in a few years.
I mean, I've been, with the NDRC since 2017, yelling and screaming out, gerrymandering matters, redistricting matters, and people are, whatever. But I actually think that what has happened over the past few months has kind of elevated this in the consciousness of people. And I think, the economic issues will be the primary drivers. But I think this democracy thing, especially if you look at gerrymandering and what they're trying to do as part of just a piece of this overall anti-democracy efforts of this administration, will be a driver. Now, just between us, we'll keep this in the room. If you look at the Texas stuff that they've done, they might have ended up creating what we call a dummy mander. They drew these lines based on the 24 turnout in the presidential election. If you look at the 2020 election, that certain 5 seats goes down to about 2. And so if it's a wave election in 26, as I expect it will be, the question is whether or not it'll be a fair election, but that's a whole other conversation. You could see that 5 guaranteed seats. I think that 2 are certain. They'll get 2 seats out of it. But the good possibility exists that they might not get the additional 3. And as Vanita was saying, one of the concerns that Republicans have in other states is that if you want to create these additional seats, it means you've got to weaken. You got to take some Republican voters out of some districts, put them in other places, and makes them more susceptible to the people. And in a wave election next year, you could see a lot of this stuff backfire.
You all were talking about how gerrymandering is a topic that sometimes people get bored with. So, we at the Holder Initiative, one of the things we say is that we encourage our students to live out the core, right, in civic and justice-related matters. So this occurred to me as I heard you say, AG Holder, say earlier that, if the system is fair, things will work out, justly. And in many ways, your 3 careers are based on the confidence that the rule of law and justice can, if it works fairly, would work in the interest of democracy. But now I'm thinking more philosophically about the question that I feel is lingering in here, and at least it lingers in my mind constantly, so I'm going to be obnoxious and ask it, which is, how do we instill or cultivate the notion of the rule of law when our branches of our government are committed to lawlessness, right? And so whether that's in electoral matters or redistricting matters, and that presents certain kinds of challenges. Like you said, we took things for granted for so long, right? And you're absolutely right. And so I'm wondering, how do we commit to this work in an atmosphere of lawlessness when a branch of the government is fairly clearly committed to that and the other branch is just letting it happen?
Well, I think we have to start with some basics, which is that people need to understand this is not normal. What we're seeing now is not normal. I served in the Justice Department under Republican as well as Democratic attorneys general, and the stuff that the Justice Department is doing now is not normal. And that's true in other parts of the executive branch as well. So that's a kind of fundamental thing. That's kind of a foundational thing. This is not normal. We need to get back to, as imperfect as it was, a system that was a lot more fair, and try to make it even more fair, than it was. I think that possibility exists. It certainly means winning elections, and it means voting in those elections, not only for, if you're Democrat, voting for Democrats, but voting for, I'm going to be honest, the right Democrats, people who are going to stand up and fight. This can't be any Democrat who doesn't think that what we're dealing with now is abnormal, that we should be just trying to, people who talk about, if you hear people talking about civility is really important, bipartisanship is really important, the fuck, I mean, well, that basically for me is a non-starter. Sorry. That's a non-starter. That's not the aim, Those are mechanisms to get to a better place. But I don't value civility and bipartisanship above substance. This is a loud nation. We yell and scream at each other, and then, that's fine. But we use that intensity of feeling, that engagement with one another to come up with ways in which we make the system, more fair. And so it means voting, it means engaging, it means being involved in our civic life. And I hope that this conversation, other things that we're doing, will spur you all as leaders to, be a part of that effort.
Yeah, it's, our Constitution is about we the people, and there are so many things happening every single day that, frankly, if one of those things happened, would have dominated a news cycle for 6 months. But is like a blip on a story because there's just so much that is happening that is breaking all of our norms and, frankly, in some instances, laws. And it is, I think that we've got to understand the role that we all play, each of us, in kind of creating the democracy or the country that we live in. And, John Lewis used to say, democracy is not a state, it's an act. And we can just be passive observers to what's happening and not understand the power that we have, whether it's here on campus or it's as voters or it's as people that, are taking action about something an injustice that's happening in their community. But that passivity is what will ultimately kind of result in a nation without the rule of law. And we are, I did a lot of scenario planning around how to protect the rule of law with Republicans and Democrats and former military, et cetera, back in 2020 and then again in 2024. And we used to talk about all these threats. What if the military took over our streets and our cities? And what if they cut all kinds of public services? And what if they tried to do mid-decade redistricting and change the rules? And it is happening now, people. Like, this is not a land of threats. This is happening on our watch. And I do think we have to understand that we are citizens and have a duty to do something, and wherever it is, and frankly, a lot of this will be in your local community, to understand, what is happening to people in your communities and to the rule of law and how that impacts real people in real communities around the country. So this is a time to wake up and to think about strategically engaging. And what is horrifying is that, as A.G. Holder said, we used to do this through debate and discussion and disagreement, and we are now seeing escalated political violence, turning to violence as a way to kind of have a reaction, which is the most anti-democratic thing. And it's not just, some of the horrific recent events. It's constant threats against our judges, our election administrators, the types of kind of public servants who are doing their jobs and making decisions and getting death threats for doing the things that are supposed to be just common democratic, action, the stuff that the folks who are at the poll sites getting threatened. And this is unacceptable. And so how do we actually, and we know we're in such a polarized time, but our voice, there is a way to use our voice to fight back and to, create big tent coalitions and figure out how you bring more people in and to organize. But I think this is, I'm as passionate as I am because I think that, there is no greater time than now to figure out how you want to engage in your democracy. It can look 1,000 different ways, but we are in a crisis, and it is not a status quo that is sustainable.
I do worry that when I come to groups like this, and probably not for any of the people who bothered to show up tonight, but I do worry, particularly when I talk to younger people, that, as A.G. Holder says, this is not normal, but for a lot of their lives, we've been in this sort of series of little poly-crises, and it just, and I do worry, when you see some of the data that shows that younger voters are becoming less enamored with democracy or less committed to the idea of democracy and to a multiracial democracy, and that worries me, right? But I think what's important for people like us to be able to say is hey, we are like a football team that is down 21 points in the first half or the first quarter, but we are good enough and we have enough tools that we can come back, but we have to work at it. We could lose this game, but we can still win it, and that is really what is important. And I think an important part of encouraging people to do that is we're not talking about going back to what was, right? Because in a lot of ways, I think to a lot of Americans of all ages, what was didn't quite work, right? It didn't quite work democratically, didn't quite work economically. There were lots of sort of things, and I keep trying to think of the phrase that I want. The one that comes to mind is "build back better," but I don't know if that's still credited or not. But we need to sort of have a vision for a democracy that is our democracy, right? The founding generation was great, but they always intended that we would take what they gave us and build on it. This is not supposed to be a static constitution. This is not supposed to be a static democracy. And we need to sort of have a vision. We need to be able to articulate that. And we need to sort of be able to encourage people, because this is not over. I do think that there is a danger of an inward retreat. As so much is going on, it's hard to. I was just talking to somebody in the elevator today. It was it's so hard to I just tune it out. And this is somebody who works in my space, right? And I think that you have to. It's easy to in places that are authoritarian is just to sort of stay with your family, just kind of lay low, kind of and I don't think that is what this moment demands, but we have to do that, we have to sort of encourage people that this can be won.
Yeah, and if history is any guide, you look at Europe in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, communism and fascism rise not because they're strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. Now, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a dictator that rises in this country. I suspect we'll always have elections. Putin has elections, but you can guarantee what the results of those elections are going to be. The form will look kind of the same, but the substance will be fundamentally different. And so I think that, to pick up on Michael's point, I think this is in some ways, the silver lining for me here is that we shouldn't be just trying to think about building back. Got to build back better. This is an opportunity for us to reimagine a lot of our institutions, a lot of the ways in which we interact with each other politically. This is an opportunity that we have, and so when we get to, 2029, and so I'm a Democrat. New Democratic president is sworn in with a new Democratic House and Senate. It's not just a question of rebuilding and making things look like they were before. How do we improve upon that which existed before this awful period that I think we will ultimately survive? This is an opportunity that we have to take advantage of.
Yeah, because clearly the kind of message that that Democrats were running on, certainly the Harris campaign last year, is that the idea that democracy is under threat is not motivating enough action, at least in terms of wins for Democrats at the presidential level, right, or at any level, right? So I think you're exactly right that this is about a kind of reconstitution of, right, or reimagining of these traditions that have served justice sometimes and often have not, as we've already highlighted. And this is a community, ironically, that, as you know, because you're part of this legacy, AG holder, that has had long-standing traditions of students engaged in politics right here on this campus, right? And so in a lot of ways, what we've seen here over the last 2 years are mobilized students around pressing issues of our time, right? And the administration's attempt to actually silence that. And so, I mean, that's a particular challenge that we're facing here. So we have just a few minutes left, but I just want to ask really quickly, you mentioned the right Democrats in your remarks earlier. Where do you see around the country, movement, electorally in terms of campaigns where we're seeing signs of the right Democrats or candidates who are understanding the urgency and then translating that into a message that might be compelling to American voters?
Well, for me, when people start to ask me to work on their campaigns for president, let's say in 2028, I'm going to be asking, what were you doing in 2025? What were you doing in early 2026? Because after, when you get close to the midterms or after the midterms, then everybody's going to, be raising their hand. But the question for me will be, what were you doing in the really dark hours? Were you raising your voice? Were you trying to galvanize support for our democracy? And there have been more than a few voices, some louder than others, some have gotten more attention than others. But for those who kind of hunkered down, cowered at this time, don't talk to me. Don't call me. I don't need you. I need the people who had the courage now to stand up. And the same thing is true of institutions. The law firms that cut deals, cowered, capitulated to the Trump administration. I want to see what they say in 2029 when they're recruiting, law students. They always talk about our commitment to the public interest, and how we do all kinds of great pro bono stuff. Really? But when it got hard, what did you do? You bent over. You capitulated. And that's not. So institutions and people, I think, should be tested, held to that which they do, right now. And I'll give them a little bit of grace. End of this year, couple of months, so you can stand up now, and then maybe a few months into 2026. And if your voice is not raised at that point, if you're not doing, something, don't bug me come 2028.
Okay, so I think we have some time for questions. Yeah, we have some time for questions and answers from the audience. So are we going to have a mic going around? Okay, great. Okay. Let's go the orange right back here. I think it's orange. Yeah, yes. Or red, close enough.
It's more, I think, more brown
Brownish.
actually than,
I
Frank
my-
doesn't.
It's a red. I
No
call it a
fashion
red.
sense here. No fashion sense.
Absolutely none.
I have lots of different questions, but I think the one that I'll go with is, as someone who's not a lawyer, as someone who has lived in New York for 15 years, who grew up in San Francisco, I feel like my voice doesn't hold weight outside of my friends, outside of my community, because I'm just looked at as this, crazy liberal who hasn't experienced real America or some nonsense like that. So, what are ways that I can support the people who are trying to get these messages out into places that, maybe there can be movement, maybe there is more of a middle ground or a more moderate point of view. Like, what can I do, and what can those who are in this room do that is going to have an impact outside of New York City or the tri-state area?
That's a really good question. It's coming from somebody who came from the People's Republic of San Francisco and now lives in communist New York. And this is the commercial now. We have at the NDRC, one of our components is called All on the Line. It's allontheline.org. And that is where we empower people in very blue states to get engaged and do a variety of things that will have an impact in red states through the magic of, Zooms and all the electronic stuff that you guys are much more familiar with than I am. So that's a way. That's at least one of the ways in which you can get involved. But I also don't think that you should think that because I live in a blue state that's doing things correctly, that you don't have a responsibility to try to. And then your question, I think, evidence is to find a way to try to have an impact on the nation as a whole. I mean, that's what this is about. This isn't a sectional fight. This is for the soul of this nation. And so, as I said, all on the line. Just punch that in. And obviously, your studies matter more than anything, Professor. I said the right thing. But to the extent that you have some extra time, we are more than glad to welcome you into our effort. Allontheline.org.
I also think there's, just like All on the Line, there's so many kind of organizing efforts that allow, your question shows us that you kind of have humility about your own background and understand that you may not be, if you bring that in and you make assumptions based on kind of your own upbringing, that's an issue. But so much of what we have learned in the last few years in organizing is that we have to meet people where they are, and people have a lot of different struggles in different communities. Every community looks different, and if you come in making a set of assumptions based on how you grew up, I grew up, et cetera, that's where, charges of elitism, of being disconnected, of not being able to appreciate the very real things that people go through or that they're struggling with, which everyone's got struggles, but they may look different in different parts of the country along different kind of class and racial backgrounds as well. And I just think that we all need to do a better job of kind of trying to meet people where they are, and also recognizing that we have to build bigger tents and coalitions that of people who care about the values that we care about. It's really hard. It's our media ecosystem is polarized, our communities are polarized, our politics are polarized, but there's really effective organizing happening, and folks they're conscious about kind of what assumptions and biases they bring into conversations with people, and can kind of work on those and help engage with people on the things that matter to them. And that's a real art, and I think we have to, get a lot better at it.
And I think people will be happy to hear from you in many parts of the country that you may not think that they're ready to hear from you on, because if you go to many of these places, particularly the South, like when I do presentations like this, people are just happy that somebody is paying attention to them, because they feel like they've been written off by so much of the country. And they're also tired because, they've been fighting this fight for longer, right? Like many of these governments have been going at this much longer at the state level. And they're tired of losing and losing and losing and losing, and they feel like the rest of the country has sort of given up on them. And to simply show up and be there and say, what do you need? How can I help? And I'm also willing to learn about you, I think goes a long way. And they could use the cavalry, so as it were.
I think Michael's point is a really important one. We should not assume that people in certain parts of the country, even in the reddest of states, are immune to or don't want to interact with people who care about democracy. Every time we have, at the NDRC, we've had the ability to put before the people of a state, do you want to have an independent commission draw the lines, getting back to gerrymandering, independent commission as opposed to having the state legislature? That's one in every state, Utah, Missouri, the reddest states, Michigan, all kinds, Virginia. But wherever we've had that ability, people have said yes. Something that didn't get reported on a great deal, but if you remember that tour that AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was doing with Bernie Sanders, going around to these, red states, red areas, always vote Republican, and the crowds that they were drawing was something that I thought that was really significant. And I think that's an indication of, meeting people where they are, as Vanita says, and not making assumptions about where they are or about their desire to live in a country that has a democratic system, a democracy that works, for them.
Nor should we assume that all issues are resolved within the blue state context, right, or the blue city context, right? I mean, and this is something that everybody here knows very well, is that one of the key strategies that accounts for the building of the Republican Party going back to the 1960s is these local, state elections, governor elections, right? And so that we have a consequential election happening here in New York right now with the mayor, right? So especially since the last election shows that Republican candidates have some success in New York. I mean, so there's ways in which, again, the red-blue narrative is really breaking down in some ways, and really obscures the fact that there are plenty of issues to deal with here locally, right? At the level of city council up until the state government. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for this talk. I've really appreciated it. It seems to me easy to condemn Texas for redrawing its maps behind closed doors and not listening to the public outcry. And on the other hand, it's easy in California to be on the side of angels when you're putting this to a popular vote. But do you worry that invites majoritarian influences into a process that's inherently supposed to protect the minority? And can, say, A.G. Holder, you mentioned that Utah has a bipartisan commission. Can the Utahs of the world say, we're going to suspend this, but we're putting it to a vote, so it's okay?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. I'm very concerned about that. As I said, I think earlier on, this is like a race to the bottom. I mean, I don't like what California's doing, and viewed in a vacuum, I'd be totally against it, you know, but given what happened in Texas, I just don't think that, you know, I guess what I said in the statement that I issued is that we have to preserve our democracy in order to ultimately heal it. And so my hope would be that, and it's a hope, that this stuff doesn't get entrenched and that this doesn't become the norm and that we just don't do mid-cycle redistricting or every 2-year redistricting, so that we ensure that Democrats always win, Republicans always win, and the people always lose. But no, I'm very worried about that, and I think, you know, we have to be sensitive to that. You know, I've stood against Democrats who wanted to do inappropriate things with the power that they had, gerrymandering. In the Rucho case, that's the NDRC, was against Democrats in Maryland. You know, that was they were one of the defendants in the Rucho case, and we were on the side of the plaintiffs. And so for me, again, it's always about fairness. And if it's fair, again, I think Democrats will do just fine. That's what I've told my Democratic counterparts. It's like, look, because you know, I'm not the most popular guy in the party. When I tell some congressman, you know, your district is, I don't know, 63% Democratic votes, you know, and we need, you know, if it's fair, it ought to be like 48%. I'm like, whoa. You mean, like, yeah, you might have to campaign. You might actually have to go out and, you know, convince, you know, some of the people in your district, like, earn their vote, you know. But that's what I think we need to ultimately not lose sight of. And the question that you raise is an important one. And we're playing with a little bit of fire here, you know. We are playing with a little bit of fire. And my hope is that, as I said, my 3 conditions, we can make this temporary. But that's a legitimate concern.
Back here? Yeah. The mic's coming.
Getting back to gerrymandering and how folks go more to the right or more to the left based upon, because they're only afraid of being primaried. Is that because the only people that vote in the primaries are either more left or more right?
Yeah. It is generally the case that for both parties, but particularly for Republicans in recent years, the primary electorate is much more extreme, either more to the left or more to the right, and also unrepresentative, like demographically, right? I mean, primary voters are older and
Yeah, so just to follow up, has any effort been made to draw out more voters in the primary? Would that change anything?
Well, I don't, sometimes that does occur, right? I mean, sometimes gerrymandering does try to, like, you know, protect certain people. And I think you saw that in South Carolina, where Republicans tried to make Nancy Mace's district more Republican, but also tried to keep it, you know, more to have more moderate Republicans, because at the time she was a more moderate Republican. She's since changed a bit, but and they, you know, that required doing a lot of maneuvering. But sometimes, you know, the big thing right now seems to be what is your party, right? Because that seems to be, because everybody falls in line, right? There was probably a point in time when people thought more about sort of, because there was a time when you had like liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats and the like, and so there was sort of that. But now, regardless of where you fall on the party spectrum, you do tend to sort of like fall in line, particularly when your party controls the presidency. You do everything the president wants, and I think particularly with this Congress.
Yeah, but the point is a good one. I mean, you know, primaries matter, and you can have within one party people who are, from my perspective, you know, acceptable within the party, Democrats, and, you know, then there are kind of folks who are kind of unacceptable from my perspective. And, you know, hell, you all know how important primaries are. You've got Mamdani running for mayor as the Democratic nominee because he brought into the system, you know, unexpected people, substantial numbers of young people. He's connected with a whole bunch of people, you know, in a whole bunch of different constituencies. But there, that primary really, really mattered. I mean, in the sense that you might not have expected him to win, you know, you'd expect a more establishment candidate. And, you know, he got out there, campaigned well, unbelievably well spoken, a bunch of issues that even now, you know, they're hammering him for. It kind of, from my perspective, make, you know, a lot of sense. At least try it. Doesn't work? Okay, you know, hold him responsible or try something else. But yeah, primaries matter, and we shouldn't just assume the makeup of primaries of the voting people, those who vote in primaries is static. You know, every election, every primary matters at whatever level, dog catcher, you know, to president, they all matter.
And, you know, this thing about finding new voters and having a message to bring out new voters or to bring out voters that are more likely to vote in the general but not usually in the primary that's how candidates should be if they want to win. Like you do want more voters to show up in a primary, and it could change the way that, you know, usually the base for both parties shows up. But that's got to be on the candidates to have a winning message that's bringing out new voters who may not have participated in the process before or are willing to kind of change what their typical party affiliation is because of an inspiring candidate. And so I think we should all want that in our process. And unfortunately, even in the general election, too few Americans are voting. So we've got like a big, you know, GOTV lack of kind of voter participation effort that we need to confront and really work on. And, you know, we could have a whole separate thing about that, which probably you will in a couple of years. But we need more voters to vote.
You know, the mayoral Democratic primary is an example of the possibilities that can emerge. I mean, you know, and that was totally unforeseen. So we're coming up against time, but I thought we could take maybe 2 questions. Oh, Lord, I got to make decisions now. Just one? All right, okay.
We could do two or three in like rapid order.
I think our
Yeah, we got it. We can do it. Yeah.
okay, one.
Look at Beth.
We'll go here. One.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna make it fast.
Yeah.
So I'm currently like helping with a campaign for the mayoral election, and I'm wondering like how is the connection between the local redistricting versus the national redistricting? Because I see the city commissions like in New York City are holding public hearings and keeping the neighborhood intact when they draw the council maps. So I wonder what are some of the practice we can bring from the local level redistricting to national level to make the congressional map more fair and just. Thank you.
Okay, so that's one. Where's our second? Right here in the corner. I hate to make you run around.
Are we supposed to
Ishan.
remember these questions?
I haven't written down.
Okay.
In the corner,
No.
right there.
That's a Michael
Yes.
question.
We'll do the best we can to remember.
My question is around messaging for Democrats that are kind of fighting back against what we're seeing nationally right now. It seems like our messaging is typically very reactive and not, I understand that we want to center affordability and economic issues right now, especially with the politicians and elected officials that are fighting back right now. But tonight, I've heard so many great kind of framing around this issue and how it impacts everyday Americans, and not just electorally or politically, but in our everyday lives. And I just wondered, why aren't we speaking about that more when we are engaging on this? And we do have really important Supreme Court decisions coming down. I think maybe the first that people will hear about it is once that decision has been made and it's just too late. So I do wonder, especially with the folks on the stage tonight who are probably engaging with our elected officials on that, I think that would also resonate with Republican voters as well. How redistricting can impact them economically, it can impact them in so many different ways beyond just who represents them.
Okay, all right, thank you. So messaging, and then one more, I'm gonna go over here. Yeah. Right down in the front, Ishan.
I got it.
It's a race of the
It's a race to,
I'll let you win. You're
let the
like
youngster do it.
50 years
Yes.
Hello. You talked about how the president asked for 5 votes in Texas, but what makes the Texas politicians, I guess, agree with that or go along with it? Like, what do they get out of this arrangement?
Okay, very straightforward question. Okay, let's
Okay,
do them as
so-
fast as we can.
Okay, so the first one, the New York has a pretty good system for drawing its city council districts that does a lot of the things that people typically like keeps communities together, keeps neighborhoods together. A lot of the reason that works is because there was a lot of organizing around it, particularly in the Asian community, which had been divided up very much in Queens, and people organized and kind of said like, hey, this is our neighborhood and here's the proof, and people showed up. The good news for you is that there is a bill, the Federal Freedom to Vote Act, that also has a lot of those criteria written into law. This is the bill that Congress came very close to passing in 2022, but for 2 senators who are no longer there, it would have become law. And so, there is a lot of learning about that. And, again, the stuff that you're identifying, like keeping neighborhoods together, that is a number one thing that people complain about, and the Freedom to Vote Act would fix it.
Oh, we do the third question. You want to do the third one?
I was going to do this.
So there's a messaging question, and then there's also the Texas question. Yeah.
Do you want to do the, go ahead. You should get the last word. So just on the messaging question, I mean, I think, again, I think there's work that organizers are doing on the ground that are using compelling messaging. And there's a lot of people giving Democratic leadership in Washington, D.C. a lot of responses to their views on how they're messaging right now. But I think, folks who have access to them and are doing the focus group and the polling and all of that are talking. But I think really you've got to understand your own power to be an organizer, to use the type of messaging that is going to bring people along with a value set that you care about, that you think this country is about. So I just don't think we can wait for our politicians to do and say the right things. We hope the power is with us to kind of message the way that we need to message in our local communities and to make a difference there as well. And maybe that then ends up mattering to national politicians. So and then the piece on Texas that I think is important is power and federal money. So the Texas, the governor pleased the president, and the president asked him to do a certain thing, and it entrenches Republican power in the state. But also, the federal government gives out a lot of money, and currently the administration is using the money that it gives out as both a kind of threat when they threaten to withdraw it because they don't like what a particular state is doing, or that they are funding, major infrastructure projects and other things, and so they can use their spending and their dollars to basically reward states that do the things that are aligned with what the president wants. So it isn't, I think the power piece is the biggest piece of why folks in the state and politicians in the state agreed to do this for the president, but there's also other consequences or rewards that they get when they do that.
And
But there's also
primary challenges too.
I was going to say, there's also fear.
Yeah, and fear.
If you don't go along with the president and what he wants to do, and you're a Texas Republican in a gerrymandered district, and we'll go back to that, what does that mean? You have a primary challenge. And if you're in the Republican Party in the Trump era, and if Trump decides to endorse your state legislative Republican opponent in a primary, that could be your political death. And so there might be benefits, but there's also the fear that drives people. And with regard to messaging, I think that's an important thing. Maybe we end here. We have to have messaging that makes people understand. I mean, when I talk about gerrymandering and redistricting, that's kind of ethereal, kind of wonky, and you got to break it down for people so that they understand. If you care about choice, a woman's right to choose, if you care about economic decisions, if you care about criminal justice reform, all of this is decided by people who sit in state legislatures, and if they are not representative of the will of the people, I mean, we say we're a divided nation. We're not as divided as people think. If you look at the big issues, at 60 and 70% margins, the American people are pretty much in the same place. But our system, our political system is so fractured that we don't allow that which unites us to be shown up in the policies that we put in place. And so, yeah, we need to have messaging that makes people understand how their lives are impacted on a daily basis by that which we're talking about. But I also think that, we also need to reach high, and reach for those bouts of eloquence that we see come along every generation. Obama was certainly that kind of person. John Kennedy, certainly that kind of person. Winston Churchill, for all his faults, in his situation. The ability to have people do things for their better angels, Lincoln, it's a quote from Lincoln, that can spur people, get them engaged, and have the impact of fomenting systemic positive change. So I don't think, we ought to have Democrats need to be focused on what the price of eggs are, what are the price of eggs now as opposed to what they were, when Trump took office. Yeah, that's a talking point. Okay, gas, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that matters. I understand. It's the economy, stupid. James Carville will be like throwing things at me now. But I think it's also a function of, how do you make people understand that this experiment that we call America is really worth fighting for and how they can play a role in it. And maybe this is where I would end. You all are the best and the brightest. You really are. You're distressingly young, trust me from my perspective. But for those of you who are not necessarily college students, you're young at heart. And you should never underestimate the capacity that you have to have an impact on this nation and the direction of this nation. If you look at every social movement in this country, it was fueled by young people. Diane Nash, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, young people who ripped down a system of American apartheid. And I'm sure they must have had doubts, along the way. Can we actually pull this off? I mean, as we might be having doubts now. I mean, they seem all powerful. Are we going to actually win this? And yet they fought through those doubts and were successful in transforming the nation. Suffragettes, young women and their allies, fighting for the right to vote. And I'm sure they must have had doubts,
Abolitionists in the 19th century.
Exactly. Are we going to pull down slavery? And yet, every generation of Americans, when called upon, has successfully defended our democracy. And now it's our turn. Now it is our turn. Americans have sacrificed, given their lives, on foreign battlefields, the invasion of Normandy, American battlefields, Gettysburg, Stonewall. Here in New York, sacrificed, faced the state, the authority, faced power, all about bringing about positive change. And we still have within us that capacity, and you all have within yourselves the capacity to lead. The fact that you're here on a Thursday night means to me that you are the leaders. You're not necessarily the followers. And so I would urge you to not just say, wow, that was a really good conversation that we had. Holder was, he's okay. The other two were really good. But I'd hope that you leave here with the notion that you're going to do something. I always say this. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But it doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people like us put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And so the question is, what are we each going to do to pull that arc towards justice? What are you going to do? Leave here with that question, I think, in your mind. What am I going to do? How do I talk to my friends to get them engaged in this righteous effort to save our democracy? Be optimistic. Optimism breeds engagement. Pessimism breeds resignation. Our history tells us that we should never, ever be anything other than optimistic, and I hope that you all will be that and be the Columbia students that I know you're capable of being. Lead. Save this democracy. We can do this.
The worst thing about, applause is coming, the American Voting Project conversations, that they come to an end. Michael Lee, Vanita Gupta, A.G. Holder, thank you for your insights, your generosity, and your inspiration tonight. Round of applause for them for sure. I'm sorry that we went over time, but we had important things to discuss. And these conversations will be ongoing, certainly here at Columbia and everywhere. Thank you all for coming tonight.